Welcome back to the show. So the Biden warmongers are being confirmed by the Senate one by one, albeit they are diverse warmongers, but they are still warmongers. Sadly, they're being confirmed without much, if any, pushback from Democrats, not even from Bernie Sanders, which is extremely disappointing. In fact, these hearings are showing us who is principled and who is just partisan when we go through some of these confirmation hearings. We're going to go ahead and start with Tony Blinken. So Tony Blinken was confirmed today as Secretary of State, and he didn't get a whole lot of pushback. He got a little bit more than a couple of the other warmongers that have been confirmed into office. We're going to look at Avril Haines. We're also going to look at Lloyd Austin. And Tony Blinken did get a little bit more pushback. There were 22 Republicans who voted against him versus those who voted for him. But this was Rand Paul. Now, Rand Paul questioned him this was about a week ago, when this was the hearings that were happening before Tony Blinken went fully to the Senate for the full confirmation vote. And Rand Paul, who is notoriously anti-war, he's sick of the regime change wars. He's sick of these endless wars. He is somebody who's been a staunch critic of the Patriot Act. He is a staunch critic of any sort of surveillance on Americans or any diminishing of our rights by the deep state or by the intelligence community. And he really, really laid in on Tony Blinken. So we're going to go ahead and watch some of the clips from Rand Paul in his interrogation, essentially. But really, it was more of, I would say, not so much questioning, but he pretty much just lectured him. But it's great. Here it is.
Like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, you've been a consistent supporter of military intervention in the Middle East, from the Iraq War to the Libyan War to the Syrian Civil War. Some on your side of the aisle, including the president-elect, have said, well, we were given bad intelligence. They misled us on the intelligence on Iraq. That's a very specific reason. There's probably some truth to it, but I think it misses sort of the lesson of the Iraq War. Likewise, your justification for maybe coming to a new approach on the Libyan civil war is, well, maybe we overestimated the idea of having viable successors there. To me, it seems like we're still missing the point, because even after Libya, you guys went on to Syria wanting to do the same thing again, and you've argued, well, maybe we just didn't do enough. If we'd done more, we could have toppled Assad and we could have had real regime change in Syria. Well, you got it in Iraq, you got it in Libya, and it's a disaster. The lesson of these wars is that regime change doesn't work. People say, oh, we're going to get rid of the iron fist, and Thomas Jefferson's going to arise from the ashes. Well, that is a naive notion to believe that Thomas Jefferson or his like live in Libya or live in Iraq. Their tradition is so much different than ours. I mean, we've been fighting against centralized power in the English tradition for 1,000 years. The revolution in England was 350 years ago. Ours was 250 years ago. That tradition they don't have. They have a tribal existence. You trade one for another. But mostly what you've gotten through the policies you have advocated, and Joe Biden has advocated, and frankly, John Bolton has advocated, this idea of regime change has been a disaster for the Middle East. We complain, everybody around here is concerned, Iran, Iran, Iran. Well, why is Iran stronger? Who's their best friend in the region now? Iraq. We did that. We had a balance of power. It wasn't perfect, but we had somewhat of a balance of power in the Middle East, and you guys messed it up. You got rid of the one bad guy, and another bad guy got stronger. And so then you went to Libya and did the same thing. And they said, well, maybe Libya's a one-off. Well, maybe there's a rule here. Maybe there's something we can learn about regime change, and maybe we can learn that humility would be that maybe we shouldn't be choosing every government in the Middle East. I would argue that instead of always choosing the governments, maybe we should not reward the bad ones. You know what I mean? So, for example, with Saudi Arabia, I despise the regime. I'd probably still trade with them. I probably wouldn't cut them off completely. I wouldn't sell them any more arms. And after they killed Khashoggi, they shouldn't have got one bit of our armaments. But both sides advocate for this. On UAE, we tried to stop that because UAE has a terrible human rights record. Both sides support it. The problem around here is we have bipartisan consensus. The problem isn't lack of consensus. The problem is too much consensus. But the consensus is for regime change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is calling it out. He's calling out the warmongers, and you can always count on Rand Paul to do this. They are 100% aligned in consensus when it comes to war. And Rand Paul is one of the few senators that stands up and says, this is ridiculous. We cannot continue doing this. We cannot be in these endless wars that make absolutely no sense and that have nothing to do with our national security. Now, I want to point out that 22 Republican senators voted against Tony Blinken's confirmation, but many of them, all of them Republicans. There was not one single Democrat, not one single Democrat. Now, Tony Blinken came from West Exec Advisors, where he helped secure contracts, big military contracts for the big tech companies like Google and Microsoft and IBM. We actually don't know because West Exec Advisors are not technically lobbyists. They don't do the talking for the companies. They instead advise and they do introductions and they tell them what to say. But because they're not the ones who actually do the lobbying for the money themselves, they're allowed to keep their client list secret. So Tony Blinken, we don't know how many military contracts he was able to help secure. We have an idea. We know it was massive. We know it was billions and billions of dollars for these companies. We don't know exactly which companies. We just kind of have to guess. So Antony Blinken, however, when he was Deputy Secretary of State under John Kerry, and when he also worked with Hillary Clinton, this is what Rand Paul is talking about. He's saying, you and Hillary Clinton were all about these bombings and all about these invasions. And he's saying, if you could have gone in and done what you did to Syria, if you could have done that the way that you did to Iraq, you probably would have. Tony Blinken comes back out and says during this, he says, no, I wasn't for that. I wasn't for going in and doing to Assad what we did to Saddam Hussein. I didn't want to go quite that far. And essentially, Rand Paul is saying to him, yeah, but now you saw that didn't work. You didn't get your end result. You didn't get Assad out. So my worry is you're going to try to go harder next time. You're not going to ease up and say, well, that didn't work. You're instead just going to go more forward with it and more aggressive with it in these regime change wars. The 22 Republicans that voted against Blinken, most of them voted against Blinken, not because they're not warmongery, or not because Tony Blinken is warmongery and these senators are not warmongery. Most of them voted for or against Tony Blinken because he's not warmongery enough when it comes to Iran. That is, most of them felt like, I don't agree with him on Iran. He's going to try to get back into that Iran nuclear deal. We don't like that. And so most of the pushback against Tony Blinken was because he wasn't warmongery enough. There were just a few senators that voted against him because they do not want regime change war. There was not a single Democrat who voted against Tony Blinken, even though he was with West Exec Advisors, even though he was the one advocating for all kinds of various different regime change with under John Kerry and Hillary Clinton. That didn't matter to Democrats, apparently, not even to Bernie Sanders. I'm surprised by that. I'm surprised that that even Bernie Sanders didn't stand up and say, we don't want more war. And we're going to get into this because Bernie Sanders actually has shown that he is not consistent in his voting. We're going to go ahead and play a few more of these Rand Paul clips because they're great. And I think we all should be, we should all write him letters saying, please do more of this because somebody's got to be calling this crap out and nobody else is. And then we're going to get into the inconsistency in the voting when it comes to the nomination, the confirmation of Avril Haines, also of General Lloyd Austin, and how the senators really showed themselves over the course of these confirmations. I'm going to show that to you. But first, let's go ahead and play this next one from Rand Paul.
You have argued when you've been part of administrations that, oh, yes, we'd like Senator Kane's a more narrow AUMF, but we don't really need it. Now, you're not alone. That sort of, I think, arrogant executive sort of attitude comes from both parties. Every president for the last 50 years. In fact, they all probably believe this. They believe they have absolute power. It's called this absolute Article 2 authority. And this runs on both sides. But it runs through the extremes on our side. The John Boltons on our side believe in this absolute Article 2 authority. The AUMF from 9/11 had nothing to do with people in Somalia. Do you think the AUMF from 9/11 authorizes you to continue the war in Somalia?
I think the AUMF from 9/11 has been used in countries and against groups that were not contemplated or cited in the AUMF, which is the very strong reason why we should revisit it.
But it's very specific. It says people who organize to attack us. It doesn't mention, if people say, well, they say and associated forces. That's not in it. That's somebody dreamed that up later and sort of said that it's in. It's not in there. It doesn't say associated forces. There is no authorization for war in Somalia, Mali, Yemen, which the Obama administration originally did support. So there really isn't. I'm not for a more narrow one. I'm just for no more war over there. I'm tired of all the war. I'm tired of all the nation building. Look, I love the rights of women as much as anybody, but if our goal is going to be that we're going to keep women in power, like in Saudi Arabia, we're going to go to war with Saudi Arabia because they don't have women ministers of health and stuff. It really isn't exactly our national security that you're talking about. You're talking about something different. Now, from the point of view of the Secretary of State, there are things you can do through soft power to advocate for the principles we believe in. But overthrowing governments to instill women's rights or to continue women's rights and to continue a military presence there and fight battles for it is really not something that is in the purview of the Secretary of State or really under the Constitution to anyone in our government.
So did you see how Tony Blinken danced around that? So he says, what do you think about this AUMF and the scope of it? And really, you guys are abusing the scope of this. It wasn't really meant for you guys to go into places like Somalia. And Tony Blinken says, well, that's why we need to revisit it. So rather than just saying, yeah, it doesn't, and we're not going to be doing any more of that because we don't have the authorization in order to go and affect all of these different regime change wars all around the world, instead of saying, yeah, we don't really have the authorization, and you're right, that's not in the scope of the AUMF, he says, well, we need to revisit it because they weren't thinking of all of these other things when they wrote that. That's basically what they weren't thinking of all of these other issues when they wrote that. And so that is why we need to revisit it. So what? So that you can expand it some more, so that you can write it in a way that it can be interpreted as such to where you can then go around and do whatever the hell you want. That's what that was. That was not a repudiation of AUMF. That was well, you know what we need to do is maybe we need to narrow it where it actually says we're allowed to do whatever it is the hell we want to do. He didn't quite, and look, to be fair, he didn't say that either, but he also didn't say that. So that's the problem. He wasn't clear on his feelings on that. So what we can expect is potentially more of this unilateral, do whatever they want in the State Department and advocate for all kinds of regime changes and meddling in other people's countries and their political systems and their elections, all of these various different things. And he's basically saying, yeah, maybe we need to revisit, but he wasn't handing it and, saying, hey, this is something we don't want. Let's go ahead and watch this last one. This is a really good one about NATO and whether or not we're going to be potentially going to war with Russia. We know how the Democrats feel about Russia. So here we go. Let's talk about Russia.
With regard to NATO, you've advocated for expanding NATO. Do you still support putting Georgia in NATO?
If a country like Georgia is able to meet the requirements of membership and if it can contribute to our collective security, yes, the door should remain open.
So if you're successful, then we would be at war with Russia now.
I actually think just the opposite. I think that, Senator, with regard to NATO membership, there's a very good reason that Russia has proved aggressive against countries that are not actually in NATO and under the umbrella, and a good reason why it's chosen not to attack.
This would be adding Georgia that's occupied to NATO under Article 5, then we would go to war.
Well, I think we've seen, again, in the past that countries that have joined NATO have not been the same target of Russian aggression that we've seen.
We were talking about 20 years ago, we might have a valid argument now. Russia occupies Georgia. Russia occupies, or proxy troops occupy part of Ukraine. So I think adding either of them to NATO not only is provocative, but you'd have to think what comes next. I mean, if we're obligated to defend our NATO allies, I mean, basically we'd be voting for war. So I wouldn't vote to add Georgia to NATO, not on your life, unless I'm ready to send my kids and your kids to go fight in Georgia.
But you see, that's exactly what Tony Blinken is ready to do. He is ready to send all of our kids off to Georgia to go fight Russia because this is what Hillary Clinton has wanted. And essentially what we have to remember is that the cabinet that is being installed is a Hillary Clinton approved cabinet. This is the one that she would have potentially put in really very closely. These are the people that Hillary Clinton surrounded herself with. These are the people that she would have wanted in her cabinet, or people that are very closely tied. Antony Blinken is very, very closely tied to Michelle Flournoy. They were business partners for West Exec Advisors. They were the founders together of that warmongering organization. And Hillary Clinton, she's really close to Michelle Flournoy. Now, Biden didn't put Michelle Flournoy into his cabinet, but he put Tony Blinken in. So, we're talking, and then they kept Michelle Flournoy at West Exec Advisor so she could continue to say, hey, call up my buddy Tony Blinken if you want to get a big contract for military defense, or not even defense. Let's not even call it that. Let's be honest about what it really is. It's military warmongering from our War Department, not our Defense Department. We don't have a Department of Defense. We have a Department of War. So Tony Blinken right there is doing the dirty work now of Hillary Clinton. He's telling you straight to your face that he's going to antagonize Putin by bringing more countries potentially into NATO. He just basically says, Georgia, you've got the green light. If you want to join NATO, you can, as long as you meet the criteria, even though Russia is currently in Georgia, occupying areas of Georgia, which means Rand Paul is right. It would automatically trigger an Article 5 and off to war we go in Georgia with Russia. Same thing with Ukraine. If Ukraine joins NATO, like the likes of Tony Blinken want to see, then off we go into war with Russia because Russia's occupying areas of Ukraine according to international law. So this is what Hillary Clinton has always wanted because she believes, for whatever reason, she still believes and she's still spreading this misinformation that's actually been investigated and found not to be true. She's continuing to spread the disinformation that Donald Trump and the Republicans, that they were somehow the Manchurian candidates for Putin, and that Donald Trump was probably even talking to Putin when he was sitting in the Oval Office the day of the Capitol insurrection. They never could link Donald Trump to Putin. They never could get that link that he was actually the Manchurian candidate of Putin, that he was just his puppet. They never could actually create that link. So Hillary Clinton continues to spread those lies about Donald Trump, lies that were actually investigated by Robert Mueller, and continues to spread those lies about others, including Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, it is disgusting that she's continued to do this, but really she has an agenda. She hates Putin. She's wanting revenge now because she believes in her core that he instilled Donald Trump and cost her the election, that she was supposed to be president of the United States. And the only reason she's not president of the United States is not because she's a terrible candidate, not because she laughed at Gaddafi dying, not because of all of these other things that she had in her past, but no, it was because of Putin. She's blaming Putin. And now she's got in the cabinet for Joe Biden, who's really just doing whatever the establishment wants because he's thrilled to be president. Same with Kamala Harris. She's just thrilled, thrilled to be standing there. Oh, she can't get over it. She can't get over it that she's vice president of the United States. And in about 3 years, she's going to be president of the United States. She just can't get over it. And so they're doing the bidding for Hillary Clinton, who wants to take out revenge on Putin. And part of that revenge is going to be bringing Ukraine and Jordan into NATO. And that will be highly problematic. And off to war we all go. This is the insanity of it. It will, you know how when everybody accused George W. Bush of going to war in the Middle East, the Iraq War, in order to get revenge for his dad? That's what we'd be doing in the Ukraine and in Georgia. This would just be revenge for Hillary Clinton. That's all this would be. It's a revenge campaign. But you know what? The country's done it once. We can do it again. That's what's going to happen here. So, but, remind you that many of the senators that voted against Tony Blinken today, they did so because they felt like he wasn't warmongering enough on Iran. But there are some that are very principled, and Rand Paul is one of them. He is very consistently anti-war. He's consistently anti-surveillance, anti the Patriot Act. Rand Paul, now looking back at some of the past votes, one of the things that when we look at, when we just go back in history to look at, well, how did Rand Paul vote when it was Mike Pompeo, or how did he vote when it was, other people that were being from his own party, for example. And looking it up, Rand Paul was consistent. He ended up voting for Mike Pompeo. He did end up confirming him, but he was the one Republican that was saying, I'm not voting for Mike Pompeo because he's a warmonger and I don't want to continue on with these wars. And then after phone calls with Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo himself, he said that he received many assurances from Mike Pompeo and that he had many long conversations with him and long conversations with Donald Trump that assured him that they would not be engaging in any new regime change wars. And that ultimately ended up being, Donald Trump did not start any new wars. So he also voted against Dan Coates, who was the nominee, I believe, under who was Dan Coates under? Maybe that was Bush. I don't think that was Trump. Was it Trump? Dan Coates, the director of national, the DNI. But Dan Coates was also a big Patriot Act guy, and Rand Paul was totally against Dan Coates for DNI. I don't know when that was. Oh, maybe that was Trump. Maybe. Oh, yeah, that was Trump. Okay, Coates was under Trump. That's right. So Rand Paul has been very consistent. It doesn't matter who the party is, whether it's his own party or it's Democratic Party. He has voted against anybody he believes is a warmonger. That brings us to Avril Haines. So Avril Haines is one that she was also confirmed recently. She's been confirmed for the Director of National Intelligence for DNI. And she also is one that Rand Paul voted against. I'm going to show you this here. This is here's Antony Blinken. Now this one is, let it load here for a second. Oh, did it not? Hold on one second. Let me get you the confirmation for Avril Haines. What happened here? How come it's not? There we go. Okay. Avril Haines, she was confirmed a vote 84-10, so she got a few more votes than Tony Blinken did. But Avril Haines also comes from West Executive Advisors, so she's also one of those. She was big on drone strikes and advocated for regime change, so she's very much the same as Tony Blinken. And there were 10 Republicans who voted against her in the confirmation, Rand Paul being one of them, also believing that she was a warmonger. He did not want to vote for her, said she's a warmonger. There was Josh Hawley felt the same way. Mike Lee, I believe, is also in that same camp of these people are warmongers. But the rest are saying, well, no, we think she's going to be soft. You know, she's not going to be hard enough on things like Iran or certain organizations or whatever. So just showing that there's some consistency there with Rand Paul. I would like to see that same consistency with the Democrats, but I'm not seeing that consistency. All of them voted for Avril Haines, every single last one of them, including Bernie Sanders, just completely disappointed in him that he would vote in these warmongers, that he would just look past their history of all of the bad things they've done and all the warmongering they've done and would confirm them. This is the time that he should have principles like Rand Paul has had in the past, where he says, I don't care what party you're from. You're a warmonger. I'm not voting for you. I don't care if I'm a Republican and you've been nominated by the Republican. You are a warmonger. I'm not voting for you. But no Democrat had that same principle. No Democrat is principled on this. They voted against many of Trump's nominees, but they voted for Biden's nominees, even though they're all from the same basket of warmongers. So she ended up being confirmed. Also, let's look at Lloyd Austin. Now, Lloyd Austin is more interesting because there was a little bit more. This is really where we saw some more principles come out, because with Lloyd Austin, now when it comes to usually, let me see if I can find his. Where is his confirmation? Let me show you what. Here it is. So here's Lloyd Austin for Secretary of Defense. So usually for the Secretary of Defense, they get, it's almost unanimous every time. It doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. They're usually, for whatever reason, it's because both sides are all about war. So when it came to Jim Mattis, now this is what's interesting. So Lloyd Austin needed to have a waiver in order to serve in this position because he hasn't been out of the military long enough. He's supposed to be out of the military for at least 7 years before he can serve as Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense position was created with a civilian in mind. The idea was a civilian would lead the Department of Defense, that there would be some civilian oversight over the military. So we're not supposed to have a military person leading the military. We're supposed to have a civilian leading the military. That position was created with that purpose in mind. So the first to break that tradition was Trump with Jim Mattis. And Jim Mattis was a retired general, but he wasn't out for long enough. So they consider you a civilian if you've been out of the military for at least 7 years. I think it should be longer than that. That's my personal opinion on that. But they say, okay, if you've been out for 7 years, then you qualify and you could be a civilian and lead the Department of Defense. Jim Mattis had only been out for a few years. It wasn't quite 7. So he needed a waiver from Congress, a congressional waiver, in order to then go through with the confirmation process to hold the position of Defense Secretary. Well, Jim Mattis, there were many, when it comes to the waiver vote, this is where we see who is principled and who's just partisan on this. And same thing with the confirmations. But when it came to the confirmation of Lloyd Austin, I want to show you this, that he did get only, his vote was 93-2. There were 2 Republican senators who voted against his confirmation. That's Josh Hawley and Mike Lee. Again, these are senators they want less war. I'm actually surprised Rand Paul wasn't in this, but Rand Paul actually in this case, he has continued to be principled, I guess, on this because he also did vote for Mattis, even though he didn't vote for Dan Coats and he didn't want Mike Pompeo. So he was still in that realm of, I don't want the warmongers as Secretary of State or warmongers as Director of National Intelligence, but he did vote for Mattis when it came to Department of Defense, and he did vote for Lloyd Austin when it comes to Department of Defense as well. So these 2 senators were the only ones who voted against him. When it came to Mattis, Jim Mattis, there was only one senator who voted against him. That was Kirsten Gillibrand. She was the only senator who voted against Jim Mattis. But what's interesting is really the waiver vote. That is where we see who is principled and who is not principled. And I made a list that I'm just going to read to you because I don't have it to show you. But I went through the 2 waivers. So we had Jim Mattis from years ago, and then we have Lloyd Austin from now. And I went through the list and I double checked all the senators to see who voted for the waiver or who voted against the waiver for Jim Mattis. And did they then also vote against the waiver for Lloyd Austin? And the reason I started looking into this was because I had discovered that Bernie Sanders, who's supposed to be principled and fighting the good fight for the people, he voted against the waiver for Jim Mattis when it was Trump who appointed Jim Mattis. And Bernie Sanders' reasoning for that was there's rules for a reason, and we shouldn't break those rules. And this position is for a civilian for a reason, and that's what we need in that position. But then what happens? Fast forward to now, and when it comes to Lloyd Austin, Bernie Sanders actually voted to go ahead and give him the waiver. That's shocking to me. So then I thought, well, I wonder who else did this. Who else is showing that they are partisan when it comes to this rather than actually being principled? And it turns out that there were quite a few. Let's go through the principled ones first. So when I double checked, I cross-checked to see, okay, who, because you kind of figure, okay, if it's a Republican or a Democrat, they're going to vote for their party. But they shouldn't when it comes to this waiver. This is something that should be a matter of principle. And it turns out that mostly Democrats are principled on this. And there was really only one Republican, maybe kind of, who might have been principled on this. But the principled senators who voted no on the waiver for Jim Mattis, and they also voted no on the waiver for Lloyd Austin, even though he was appointed by Biden, they still said no. That would be Blumenthal, Duckworth, Chris Van Hollen, Markey, Elizabeth Warren, Tester, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, Merkley, Wyden, Murray, and Baldwin. Those Democratic senators all voted no. They do not believe in the waiver at all. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican who is asking for it. Now, of course, once it got to the actual confirmation vote for Lloyd Austin, what happened? All of those Democrats suddenly, they said, well, I guess since he's here and since now this is, now we're voting for the confirmation and he's already got the waiver, then they all voted to confirm him. None of them actually said no to the confirmation. Every single last one of them voted to confirm. Jerry Moran, I think that's how you say his name, Jerry Moran, he's a Republican and he abstained from voting from both for Jim Mattis and for Lloyd Austin. So I guess that's sort of a matter of principle in a way. Now, those that showed that they were just partisan, when it comes to this. Those that just voted along party lines and they gave the waiver to their side, but they did not give the waiver to the other. That would be from the Republicans. That was Tom Cotton. That was Rubio. That was Susan Collins, Ben Sass, Burr, Tillis, Barrasso, Toomey, and Mike Lee. They all voted along party lines. They gave Jim Mattis the waiver, but they didn't give that waiver to Lloyd Austin. Democrats that did the same thing. They gave it to Lloyd Austin, but they wouldn't give it to Jim Mattis. That would be Dick Durbin. That would be Murphy. That would be Leahy. And that would be Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders! This is why this is so shocking to me, because I really didn't expect that. But I guess maybe the reason why Bernie Sanders has voted to confirm all of these warmongers, and he even gave Lloyd Austin the waiver when he didn't give the waiver to Jim Mattis, maybe the reason why Sanders did that was because he was given a committee chairmanship. And they said, you want to be committee chair? Then you're going to have to go and vote with us every single time. If this is what you want, then this is what you're going to have to get. This is what's so sad to me about this, is that Bernie Sanders had the ability to actually change the Democratic Party. He had the bully pulpit was on his side. He could have said to the Democratic Party, no, you bend to me or you're not getting my support. But instead, they played him. They were able to say to Bernie Sanders, you need to cave to us if you want to have any sort of power at all in the Biden administration. If you want to have a committee chairmanship, if you want to have anything, maybe they even offered, maybe they lied and they said, well, maybe you'll be vice president, Bernie. Maybe we'll give you the vice presidency. But then when Joe says, no, I need a woman of color, didn't matter if she's qualified. He already I'm getting a woman of color. That's what Joe Biden says. Then they say, okay, well, maybe you could get, Bernie, maybe you'll get a cabinet position, labor secretary. He wanted to be labor secretary. This maybe we'll make you labor secretary. So Bernie continues to stump for Joe and do everything for Joe. And ultimately they threw Bernie some scraps and they said, okay, we'll give you a committee chairmanship. How about that, Bernie? But you still have to go and do everything we ask of you. You have to vote for everybody that Joe nominates. You have to give up on all of your principles because guess what, buddy? You're getting a committee chairmanship. Bernie Sanders didn't need a committee chairmanship. He has the bully pulpit. He could hold all of their feet to the fire. Bernie Sanders could have made all of their lives miserable without having a committee chairmanship. The same way Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez makes their lives miserable without having much in the House. He could have been doing the same thing, but instead at the sunset of his career, he caves and he instead goes and he actually confirms, votes yes on all of these warmongers. He doesn't care. Hillary Clinton warmongers, he says, okay, let's do it. I'm getting a committee chairmanship. There was only one person that was a little bit weird. Cortez Mastro, a senator from Nevada. I don't understand this, but she voted yes for Jim Mattis, and she's a Democrat. She voted yes for the waiver for Jim Mattis, and she voted no for the waiver for Lloyd Austin. So she kind of went against party lines on both of those. And that one was just a little bit odd to me. I don't really know how to read that one, but that is what happened there. But this really kind of goes to show, who was principled and who wasn't. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when these senators, now in the House, they also had to vote for the waiver, and there were many, the whole squad, I believe, except Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna was the only one that did vote for the waiver, whereas the rest did not vote for the waiver. And I believe that they were consistent on that. Also for Jim Mattis, they did not vote for the waiver. So I didn't go through the House and I didn't check all of their votes like I did for the Senate. But I do think that there was also a principled vote on that side. Now, they don't vote to confirm, but they do have to vote on that waiver. And many of those who claim to be progressive did not vote for that waiver in the House of Representatives. But this was just really interesting to see, and it's really curious as to why Bernie Sanders would actually not be principled on this. You would think he would be principled in the same way that Rand Paul, even though I don't agree with Rand Paul on a lot of things, I appreciate that he's at least consistent, and I appreciate that he's principled and that he requires some convincing in order for him to go along with something, for him to say, okay, fine, Mike Pompeo, I will vote for you, but that's because you're giving me certain assurances, and we're going to have some really long conversations on this. It's not going to be just some, placate here and say this to me there. Rand Paul doesn't seem to be that kind of a guy. And I just am really disappointed that Bernie Sanders showed himself to not be very principled. But I am, it is nice to see that there were many other Democrats who were principled on this one issue, on the waiver issue. And Elizabeth Warren said, I didn't give Jim Mattis the waiver for a reason, and I'm not giving it to Lloyd Austin either. And I think that's the right approach. So, that's what that shows us is really there's just a lot of partisanship when it comes to politics. And as much as we would love for our politicians to stand up for principles, they often don't. They just cave to partisan hackery. And it's really, really disappointing. And that is why you can never fall in love with a politician, because they will always break your heart, as they say. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining the show tonight. Please email me if you have any comments, questions, you want to send me some news stories. You guys always send me some really great stuff. If you would please subscribe to the channel, that would be great. If you want to support the show, there's some links down below. Also, be sure to sign up for my email newsletter where I will notify you when I post content in other places that you cannot get here. So be sure to sign up for that email newsletter. And I am out of here for the night. I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you for watching.